My father's funeral was supposed to be about grief, closure, and honoring the man who had raised me with discipline and care. Instead, it became the stage for my mother's betrayal. Standing at the pulpit, veil still shading her face, she announced to the mourners that she would be cutting me out of the estate because Emily deserved it more. My younger sister, spoiled, reckless, and already drowning in debt, stood beside her, smirking as if she'd already cashed the check. I felt the eyes of our relatives burning into me, their whispered judgments confirming the humiliation. But what no one knew that day was that I had receipts, literal ones. Bank transfers, property deeds, signed agreements between my father and me. They tried to bury me alongside him, but instead, I began the quiet, methodical excavation of the truth. If Emily deserved it more, then I was about to prove what she truly deserved: exposure. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 36 years old, male, and I work as a systems auditor for a logistics firm. My whole career has been built on spotting what doesn't add up, tiny discrepancies in numbers that most people overlook. I never imagined that skill would one day save me from being erased by my own family. It was a damp March morning when we buried my father, Richard Cross. He was 68, a stern but principled man who built his life on contracts, discipline, and unspoken love. I stood near the front pew in St. Joseph's Chapel, the smell of lilies cloying and sweet, the sound of rain tapping against the stained glass windows. My black suit itched, but I didn't move. I was too focused on the sight of my mother, Margaret, standing tall at the lectern, her veil pulled just low enough to obscure her expression. Her voice was steady, not broken with grief, not trembling with loss. Instead, it rang with cold certainty. "I need to make an announcement," she said, her words carrying through the church like a judge delivering a sentence. "Richard and I have made the decision that Emily, our younger daughter, will inherit the estate. Daniel will not be included in the distribution. Emily deserves it more." I felt my chest hollow out. The murmurs began instantly, whispers passing like static across the pews. My aunt clasped her pearls. A cousin shot me a pitying glance before quickly looking away. And then there was Emily. 28 years old, standing off to the side in a sleek black dress, her lips twitching upward in the faintest smirk. She didn't even try to hide it. The humiliation burned hotter than the grief. This wasn't just about money, it was about erasure. My father hadn't even been in the ground an hour, and already my mother was rewriting his legacy, positioning Emily as the chosen one while reducing me to nothing. I didn't cause a scene. That would have been playing into their narrative. Instead, I lowered my eyes, locked my jaw, and stayed silent. But in that silence, my mind began cataloging details. The phrasing my mother used. The way Emily smirked before the words were fully spoken. The uncomfortable glances between relatives who clearly knew more than they'd admit. They thought I was defeated that day. What they didn't realize was that funerals are final for the dead, but for the living, they can be the beginning. When people talk about their fathers, they usually lean into emotions, stories of warmth, laughter, or rage. My father was different. He wasn't a man of emotions, he was a man of records. Everything in our house was logged, filed, and stored. I remember being 12 and sneaking into his study. It smelled like ink and leather, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken rules. His oak desk was stacked with manila folders, each labeled in his neat block handwriting: taxes 1989, insurance policies, property deeds. He caught me once, standing there with a folder half open, and instead of scolding me, he sat me down and said, "Daniel, if you understand paper, you understand truth. People can lie. Paper doesn't." That lesson never left me. It's why I became a systems auditor. Numbers were my language. Patterns my instinct. And as I grew older, I realized my father had been grooming me, not Emily, for responsibility. She was the golden child, yes, but only in appearances. Beneath the surface, she was reckless. In college, Emily burned through 2 credit cards in 6 months. My father paid them off quietly, the receipts filed in his study. When she totaled her first car, a midnight blue Civic, he replaced it within weeks, though he kept the insurance claim in his cabinet. I remember him shaking his head as he signed the replacement title: "She's not ready, Daniel. But one day, she'll expect everything." That's why my mother's words at the funeral felt so wrong. My father wasn't careless. He wouldn't just leave everything to Emily. He believed in documentation. If what she claimed was true, there would be a trail. A signature. A notarized will. Something. The night after the funeral, when the house was finally quiet and Emily had gone out with friends, yes, she actually went bar hopping after the burial, I slipped into my father's study again. The room hadn't changed since childhood. Same oak desk. Same heavy scent of ink and dust. Same locked cabinet. I still knew where he kept the spare key. Inside, rows of binders lined up like soldiers. One binder caught my eye, Estate 2023. I pulled it down, heart thudding, hand steady. Inside were meticulous notes, asset breakdowns, life insurance policies, property appraisals. My name appeared more than once. A savings account in my name. A joint property title, already signed. But then, something odd, a will dated 6 months ago. The signature was his, but the pen stroke was shaky, uneven, unlike the steady precision he was known for. My auditing brain flagged it immediately. Either his health had declined more than I knew, or someone had helped the pen along. As I sat there flipping pages, the phrase echoed in my head, "Emily deserves it more." If my mother was telling the truth, there had to be a legitimate document. If she was lying, then she was using Emily as a shield. And if there was one thing I knew, it was this: paper doesn't lie. That night, I promised myself I would follow the trail, every receipt, every deed, every signature. My father had left behind more than memories. He had left behind a map. And I was going to follow it until the truth burned them both. Emily always had a way of making the world bend around her. She was born 6 years after me, and from the moment she could walk, my mother made sure the spotlight never left her. At family gatherings, I was introduced as Daniel, the serious one, while Emily was our little star. I remember her 16th birthday vividly. My father had bought me a used Toyota Corolla when I turned 16, a practical, dented car with over 100,000 miles on it. When Emily's day came, she walked out to the driveway to find a brand new white Jeep Grand Cherokee wrapped in a red bow. The price tag was more than my father's annual salary had been when I was her age. "Emily deserves the best," my mother said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I kept my mouth shut. That was my role: quiet, steady, dependable. But underneath the gloss, Emily's life was chaos. She dropped out of her first college after failing half her classes, blaming the professors for being jealous of her potential. My father paid for her to re-enroll at another university, only for her to quit a year later after racking up thousands in unpaid tuition and book fees. When she turned 21, she maxed out 3 credit cards in under 8 months. One of them was a platinum card with a $15,000 limit. I knew because I found the shredded bill in my father's wastebasket during one of my visits. He paid it quietly, muttering to himself as he signed the check, but his hands trembled. My father never bragged about her. In fact, when it was just the two of us, he often sighed and said, "She's a storm, Daniel. Pretty to look at, but she'll destroy anything that stands too close." Still, my mother shielded Emily from consequences. Every mistake was brushed off as growing pains. Every bailout was justified as an investment in her future. It was maddening to watch, but I had learned early on that protesting was useless. My mother didn't want fairness, she wanted loyalty to Emily. That dynamic came to a head 2 years before my father's death. Emily had convinced my parents to co-sign on a condo for her downtown. Within a year, she'd stopped paying the mortgage. Letters piled up, foreclosure warning stamped in red. My father was furious. He kept every notice in a file labeled Emily, condo default. I remember him sitting across from me one night, the file open on his desk, his face pale under the lamp. "She thinks life is a stage, Daniel. But money isn't theater. Debt doesn't disappear when the curtain falls." And yet, 2 weeks later, the debt was cleared. Paid in full. My father's handwriting on the check. My mother's proud voice at dinner: "See? Emily's just going through a rough patch. She deserves a second chance." That phrase again: she deserves it. Always Emily. Always more. By the time we reached the funeral, Emily had become untouchable in my mother's eyes. She could do no wrong, even as she left a trail of destruction behind her. Which made my mother's declaration, "Emily deserves it more," not just insulting, but deeply suspicious. Because I knew my father. He wasn't blind. He kept records of every bailout, every mistake, every rescue mission Emily dragged him into. And those records weren't just paper, they were proof. Proof that he never intended for her to be trusted with everything. The golden child had been polished by my mother's hands for years. But beneath the shine, the cracks were deep. And I was about to make sure everyone saw them. Grief has a strange way of sharpening the senses. While the rest of the family drifted through casseroles, condolences, and the rote rituals of mourning, I found myself hyper-aware of details: the creak of the hallway floorboards, the faint tang of printer ink lingering in my father's study, the nervous way Emily checked her phone every few minutes as if waiting for an update. I didn't cry much that week. I couldn't. The anger was too raw, too consuming. Every time I replayed my mother's words, Emily deserves it more. My jaw locked tighter. She hadn't just cut me out, she'd announced it like a performance, knowing the shame would stick to me longer than the grief. But rage without strategy is noise. And noise gets ignored. I knew I had to be precise. So I started where I always start, with records. In the evenings, after my mother had gone to bed and Emily had slipped out to drink with friends or visit her latest boyfriend, I would retreat into the study. My father's study wasn't just a room, it was an archive. I pulled binders one by one, scanning their contents like a machine. Tax returns from the early 2000s. Investment statements. Insurance renewals. Property titles. My father's handwriting was everywhere, steady and exacting, like a man who trusted paper more than people. I found something curious in the estate 2023 binder. Alongside the shaky will I'd seen earlier, there were earlier drafts, wills from 2018 and 2020. In both of them, the estate was split evenly between me and Emily. The assets were itemized down to the cent, with clear instructions on how to distribute property, savings, and stocks. No ambiguity. So why the sudden change 6 months ago? Why the uneven signature? The pattern nagged at me. My father hadn't been incapacitated 6 months ago, not fully. He was slower, yes, his handwriting less perfect, but not that unsteady. And more importantly, he was lucid. If he had truly changed his will to give Emily everything, there would have been notes. Letters. At least a mention. But there was nothing, only that shaky page. I began cross-referencing dates. The last will was dated July 14th. On July 15th, I had an email from my father asking me to review a minor discrepancy in his pension account. His tone in the email was sharp, clear, and decisive. The contrast was glaring. The more I dug, the more the silence in the record screamed. My father left trails for everything: receipts for Emily's debts, annotations on mortgages, detailed logs of his health insurance claims. But around July, there was a gap. No notes. No annotations. Just the suspicious will, dropped into the binder like a foreign body. I started keeping my own log. Every evening, I typed notes into a private spreadsheet: dates, anomalies, signatures to compare, inconsistencies in language. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was building a case. The anger kept me awake. At night, I'd lie in bed, hearing the faint laughter of Emily drifting in from the porch as she smoked with her friends, her voice carefree, detached. She'd lost nothing. She was gaining everything. And she thought I would just fade into the background, the forgotten son. But rage has a way of refining itself into discipline. Silent rage is sharper than loud fury. And as I sifted through paper after paper, I realized something that made the anger even colder, more focused. If this will was forged, or coerced, it wasn't just Emily's greed at work. My mother was complicit. And that made the betrayal cut deeper than I'd ever imagined. In auditing, the first rule is simple: discrepancies don't exist in isolation. If something doesn't add up on one page, the ripple will show up somewhere else. My father had drilled that into me long before I wore a suit and carried a company laptop. Every lie leaves a trail, he'd say. I started with the signatures. I scanned the wills from 2018, 2020, and the suspicious 2023 version, overlaying them digitally. The earlier signatures aligned almost perfectly, the loop in his R, the cross on his T. But the 2023 signature sagged, the pressure uneven, as if someone had guided his hand or copied it clumsily. The metadata from the scanned PDF was even more telling: the file had been created on my mother's laptop, not my father's. That was my first crack. Next, I pulled the property deeds. My father and I co-owned a small rental property on Birchwood Lane. I remembered signing the papers with him 3 years ago. Yet, in the estate binder, the property was listed solely under Emily's allocation. Curious, I ran the deed through the county's public record database. The last transfer was indeed signed, by my father, just 2 months before his death. But the notary's name rang a bell. She wasn't one of his usual notaries. She was a friend of Emily's from college, someone I'd seen tagging along at parties years ago. The deeper I dug, the messier it got. A savings account that had always been earmarked for me, one my father had mentioned directly, was suddenly missing from the binder. I traced it through bank statements and found it had been closed out 6 weeks before his death. The funds? Transferred into an account under my mother's maiden name. It was a perfect smoke screen: selective paperwork, just enough legitimate signatures to look official, just enough omissions to rewrite the truth. But here's the thing about smoke screens: if you stand still long enough, the air clears. One night, I stayed in the study past 2 a.m., cross-referencing dates on property appraisals against the official county logs. That's when I caught the second crack: A valuation letter supposedly dated in May, yet watermarked with the county's new seal, which wasn't adopted until August. Sloppy. Too sloppy for my father. I leaned back in his leather chair, the document spread across the desk like a crime scene. Emily and my mother thought they were clever, but their arrogance was showing. They believed the family's silence would shield them. They thought grief would make me blind. Instead, grief sharpened me into a blade. I wasn't ready to confront them yet. Confrontation without proof is noise, and noise gets dismissed. No, I needed more. Metadata, corroboration, public records that couldn't be denied. I needed a net so tight they'd strangle themselves in it. So I began assembling what I called the ledger. A master file where every inconsistency lived: forged signatures, suspicious transfers, altered deeds, false valuations. Piece by piece, it was becoming undeniable. And as I saved the file under an innocuous name, Travel Expenses 2023.xlsx, I felt something I hadn't since the funeral. Control. I knew better than to rely only on what I found in the house. Anything stored under my mother's roof could be tampered with, shredded, or conveniently misplaced the moment she sensed my suspicion. If I wanted proof that couldn't be erased, I had to widen the search. The first step was the probate filings. I logged into the county's public access portal and requested digital copies of every document related to my father's estate. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in my office mailbox at work, neutral territory, away from my mother's prying eyes. Inside were certified copies of the will, deeds, and associated filings. I compared them to the binder at home. They didn't match. The county's copy of the 2023 will was scanned with a timestamp, July 14th at 3:47 p.m. The scan location? A notary office downtown. But the binder in my father's study contained a hard copy stamped by a different notary, Emily's college friend. 2 wills, both dated the same day, both with his name, but different witnesses. That wasn't just sloppy. That was fraud. Next, I went after the financials. I filed a FOIA request with the State Pension Board, asking for all correspondence logged under my father's account. 3 weeks later, I had them, copies of his July emails, each one clear, lucid, and signed electronically with his official digital key. There wasn't a single mention of a will change, no hint of confusion, no sign of deteriorating capacity. If anything, he was still correcting minor accounting errors right up until mid-July. Then came the property. I visited the county recorder's office in person, requesting to see the original hardcopy deed transfer for Birchwood Lane. The clerk was reluctant at first, but when I presented my own co-owner ID, the folder was pulled. And there it was, my father's signature, jagged and uneven, but this time, attached to a notarization stamp that looked off. The embossed seal was faint, inconsistent. I asked for the notary's log. According to the official record, my father had never been in her office. That meant one thing: someone had stamped that deed outside the proper chain of custody. And if I could prove it, the entire transfer was void. Piece by piece, the net was tightening. Every document I cross-checked revealed more sloppiness. Dates that didn't align. Metadata that contradicted the story. Notaries who couldn't back up their logs. Meanwhile, Emily strutted around as if she already owned everything. She'd started talking about her house, meaning my father's, and she'd posted a selfie on Instagram with the caption, "New chapter, new keys, key emoji, #blessed." I saved a screenshot, metadata intact. Evidence of intent. The more I built my ledger, the calmer I became. Rage had transformed into precision. Precision into inevitability. They thought they'd buried the truth with my father, but they had no idea I was digging deeper than they ever anticipated. And as the evidence mounted, one thought crystallized in my mind. I didn't just want to prove they lied. I wanted them to choke on their own lies, publicly, irrevocably, and with no escape. I didn't confront Emily outright. That would have been too easy for her. If she could dismiss me as the bitter older brother, then everything I'd built so far would collapse under family politics. No, I needed her to trip over her own arrogance. The first opportunity came over dinner at my mother's house. It was a Saturday, barely a month after the funeral. Emily waltzed in 20 minutes late, sunglasses still perched on her head despite the evening light, her phone buzzing every few minutes. She plopped down at the table and announced, "Sorry, traffic was insane. Anyway, I was meeting with the interior designer. Dad's study is so dark, I want to brighten it up." My mother smiled proudly, as if Emily had already inherited the walls around us. I chewed slowly, careful not to react. Instead, I asked casually, "That's quick. Did probate even release the estate yet?" Emily froze for a fraction of a second. Then she laughed too loudly. Obviously, it's just a matter of time. Mom and I know what Dad wanted. It was a slip. Probate hadn't been finalized. Legally, she shouldn't have been making decisions, or hiring designers. I noted the timestamp on my watch. 7:42 p.m. mental log, Emily referencing possession before probate. A week later, I called her under the pretense of needing some of Dad's old files for my taxes. Do you know where he kept the pension statements? I asked. She hesitated. Weren't those in the 2023 binder? That stopped me cold. I hadn't mentioned the binder. Not to her. Not to anyone. Only my mother and I had access to the study, and my mother never called it a binder. She referred to it as your father's files. I kept my tone even. Funny, I thought you hadn't gone through his things. Her response was a little too sharp. Well, Mom showed me. What's the big deal? You don't need to know everything. Another crack. She was admitting knowledge she shouldn't have had, knowledge she could only have gained if she'd been part of the fabrication. I saved the call recording. In my state, one-party consent was legal. Another breadcrumb. The final push came 2 weeks later, when Emily posted a photo of herself at a downtown notary's office with the caption, "Paperwork isn't glamorous, but worth it for what's mine." #adulting. The date? July 14th, the exact day of the suspicious will. The problem? The office she tagged wasn't the one listed on the county's copy. She couldn't keep her story straight. The facade was cracking, and she didn't even see it. She thought her careless boasting made her look powerful. To me, it was evidence, layer upon layer of it. I wasn't ready to spring the trap yet, but the noose was tightening, and Emily was the one tugging it around her own neck. Evidence alone wasn't enough. Courts didn't convict on suspicion, and families didn't turn on golden children over whispers. I needed Emily to incriminate herself, verifiably, in a way she couldn't claw back or deny. That meant I had to set the stage carefully, bait the hook, let her bite, and make sure the recording held. I began by planting a seed. Over coffee one afternoon, I told my mother that Dad's pension administrator had been asking for clarification about the last-minute changes. I phrased it casually, like it was nothing more than bureaucratic red tape. My mother frowned, stirred her tea twice, then waved it off. But Emily's eyes lit with curiosity. 2 days later, Emily texted me, "Hey, do you still have Dad's old files? Mom wants me to double-check something in case there are questions." That was my opening. I invited her to meet me at my apartment. I told her I had some of Dad's papers spread out, but I needed her help making sense of them. What she didn't know was that I'd already set up 2 hidden audio recorders and 1 discrete camera angled at the table. Everything would be timestamped, logged, and backed up to a cloud server as soon as the devices powered on. When she arrived, she wore that same smug expression she'd carried since the funeral. She tossed her purse on the couch, plopped into a chair, and started flipping through the stack of documents I'd arranged. I'd placed the 2020 will on top, with the 2023 version halfway down, just waiting to be discovered. Sure enough, her fingers froze when she saw it. "This one," she said quickly, pulling it free. "This is the real one. The others don't matter." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Strange. This copy says it was notarized by your friend, Claire. But the county records list a different notary." Her face flushed. "Well, yeah, Dad was confused that day. So Mom and I made sure it got done properly. Claire was just helping. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. She had just admitted, on camera, that she and my mother had inserted Claire into the process. I pressed gently. "But why would Dad sign 2 wills on the same day?" She sighed dramatically, like I was too dense to understand. "Because he wanted to make sure I got everything, okay? Mom and I had to nudge him, but it's what he really wanted. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." There it was. Clear as glass, acknowledgement of manipulation, acknowledgement of nudging a dying man, acknowledgement of intent. I didn't push further. I nodded, pretended to accept it, and slid the papers back into a folder. The recording had everything I needed. More would only risk tipping her off. As she left that night, humming to herself, I felt a calm settle over me. For weeks, I'd been chasing trails of paper, stitching inconsistencies into a ledger. Now I had the missing piece, a confession, captured in her own voice, in her own words, with the timestamp to prove it. Emily thought she had secured her inheritance. She thought she had nudged me into silence. But in reality, she'd walked straight into the trap. The timing had to be perfect. Dropping evidence too soon would only give my mother and Emily a chance to circle the wagons, spin a new narrative, or quietly destroy whatever documents I hadn't yet secured. I needed to strike in a forum where they couldn't wriggle free, a place where lies would collapse under the weight of verifiable proof. That place was the probate hearing. It was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in courtroom 4B, a beige chamber with buzzing fluorescent lights and an overworked clerk who called cases in monotone. My mother and Emily sat side by side at the petitioner's table, dressed in coordinated black, Emily with her hair swept into an immaculate bun as if she were auditioning for the role of responsible heir. My mother kept her chin high, radiating disdain even before the proceedings began. When the judge asked if there were any disputes, I stood. My voice didn't waver. Yes, Your Honor. I contest the validity of the 2023 will on the grounds of fraud and undue influence. The air in the courtroom shifted. My mother's head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing. Emily muttered something under her breath, shaking her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. But I wasn't there to make noise. I was there to deliver proof. I submitted my evidence binder to the clerk. 2 conflicting wills dated July 14, notarized by different individuals. Metadata from the PDF showing the suspicious will was created on my mother's laptop. County property records contradicting the estate binder's allocations. The notary log proving my father was never present at the office where one deed had been witnessed. Financial transfers showing accounts drained into one under my mother's maiden name. And finally, the recording. The courtroom was silent except for the tinny playback of Emily's voice. Mom and I had to nudge him, but it's what he really wanted. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. When the audio ended, you could have heard a pin drop. Emily's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. My mother leaned forward, hissing, "Daniel, how dare you," before the judge raised a hand to silence her. The judge's tone was measured but sharp. This court takes allegations of fraud very seriously. Based on the evidence presented, I am ordering a forensic review of all will-related documents, and the questionable transfers are to be frozen pending investigation. The color drained from my mother's face. Emily buried her head in her hands. For the first time since the funeral, the balance shifted. They weren't in control anymore. Their lies had been dragged into the light, documented, time-stamped, corroborated, and as I sat back down, calm and deliberate, I realized something. Public exposure wasn't about shouting the truth louder. It was about forcing the truth into a place where it couldn't be ignored. The courtroom had become that place. And their facade had finally cracked beyond repair. The forensic review moved faster than I expected. Within weeks, the court-appointed investigator confirmed what I already knew. The 2023 will had been tampered with. The shaky signature wasn't consistent with my father's historical writing samples, and the notary stamps didn't match official embossing standards. Worse for Emily and my mother, the financial transfers showed a clear chain, from my father's closed account, into one under my mother's maiden name, and then partially into Emily's. Fraud wasn't just suspected anymore. It was documented. The next probate session felt different. Emily didn't arrive in her polished bun and designer dress, she looked disheveled, her makeup smeared, eyes darting nervously. My mother wore her usual armor of pearls and posture, but her voice had lost its sharpness. The judge's ruling was clinical, but devastating. The 2023 will was invalidated. The estate reverted to the 2020 will, splitting assets evenly. The questionable property transfers were voided, restoring joint ownership of Birchwood Lane to me. The financial transfers into my mother's maiden name account were referred to the district attorney for review. Emily whimpered audibly when the decision was read. My mother sat rigid, jaw clenched, but her hands trembled on the table. For me, there was no surge of triumph, no fist-pumping victory. Just a quiet sense of balance being restored. My father's careful records had spoken louder than their lies, and in the end, truth was heavier than their fraud. The fallout spread quickly. Extended relatives whispered about the scandal. My aunt, who had once looked at me with pity at the funeral, now avoided eye contact with my mother. Emily's friends, who had cheered her Instagram posts about her house, disappeared from her feed. The golden child's shine had finally dulled, exposed for what it was, desperation wrapped in entitlement. When the judge adjourned, I didn't linger. I gathered my papers, nodded politely to the clerk, and walked out into the crisp winter air. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice cracking for the first time, not with grief, but with fear. Reversal doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes in silence, like a tide receding, leaving those who once strutted exposed and stranded on bare sand. For me, it was enough. The weeks after the ruling felt oddly quiet. The storm had passed, but its debris lingered everywhere. Emily disappeared from social media, her accounts either deleted or locked behind private walls. Word circulated that she'd been forced to move out of her condo after creditors came knocking, this time with no one left to bail her out. My mother stopped calling. No invitations to dinner, no passive-aggressive voicemails. Silence. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was peace of a kind. I had spent my whole life competing with a phantom of her making, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. Now, the illusion was gone. My mother couldn't spin away a judge's ruling or undo the recordings. At night, I found myself back in my father's study, sitting in his chair. The leather still creaked the same way, the faint scent of ink still hung in the air. For the first time since the funeral, I let myself feel the loss. Not the anger, not the betrayal, but the absence of the man who had taught me that paper was truth, and that truth always left a trail. I sifted through the files one last time. Tax returns, property deeds, insurance policies. Each page was a reminder that my father trusted me to understand the weight of responsibility, even when my mother and sister tried to erase me. Justice didn't bring joy. It brought clarity. My father's legacy wasn't just about money or property, it was about discipline, accountability, and refusing to look away from the uncomfortable. As I closed the final binder and locked the cabinet, I knew the war was over. Not with a bang, but with balance restored. I turned off the light, let the darkness settle, and whispered into the quiet room. Dad, they tried to bury me with you. But I dug them up instead.